Hello and welcome back. Happy Thursday, everyone. Today we are going to be doing a rundown of Dev Diary 128, which is going to be the political movement rework. Now, I kind of feel multiple ways about this rework in terms of it is really going to be taking away one aspect of player agency. That I don't think is probably very good for the simulation, but in terms of gameplay, multiculturalism, passing multiculturalism, extremely important, and this rework is going to kind of do away with that as it seems currently. Of course, there's also going to be a discrimination rework, shout out to racism, where we are going to get different varying levels of stratification, of acceptance and this sort of thing, and maybe with that the essentiality of getting multiculturalism will not be as prominent. But without further ado, let's get into it. We of course do have the perfect spelling here at the start. Happy Thursday, as one should put. It is just that it is a happy Thursday. Last Thursday was not happy. We did not have Dev Diary news, but this Thursday is a happy Thursday, so fantastic to see it. We love to see it. Also, happy Thursday on the Discord with the announcement of this Dev Diary, so for those of you who clicked from the Discord, you got a double happy Thursday. Shout out to you guys. Happy Thursday, and welcome back to another Victoria 3 development diary, complete with a loud car. This week, I'll be talking about the political movement rework I mentioned back in Dev Diary 126, which will be coming to you with update 1.8 slated to release later in the year. So we're expecting it before they go on winter break. Before I start, you already started, my guy, what do you mean? Before I start, I want to reiterate, here we have the disclaimer, that this feature is very much under active development, and any screenshots or numbers shown are very much not indicative of what will be present on actual release, and the UX in particular will be in a very rough state, so don't read too much into it. So here's the everyone's gonna read into it. We're gonna read into it. That's how it goes. Right then, as I stated previously, the principal goal of this rework is to change political movements from temporary demands into long-term ideological forces that can shape the landscape of your country. Now, as far as the simulation goes, this is definitely a large improvement, and currently, right now, it feels that political movements don't really feel like movements. They just feel like kind of opportunistic, I don't know, bags or containers or something for whatnot that your radicals just jump on, and they jump on indiscriminate of any type of, leaning or agreement or long-term tracking or any type like this. And so primarily how it works right now is political movements are just driven they're just driven by radicals. If you have a lot of radicalism, your political movements will be large, and if you don't have a lot of radicals, then they never matter. So but the point is you can slingshot from one political issue to one that is completely opposed in terms of what your radicals will support, which doesn't make any sense. And the political rework movement, as far as the simulation goes, does seem to be improving on this. So what does that mean in practice? Well, theory is practice in practice, but not in practice. Well, one of the most significant differences is that movements are no longer formed around the enactment, preservation, or preservation of a single law. Instead, there's a variety of movement types, each with its own unique agenda and conditions, but which can be broadly broken down into three categories. And so the fact that it's not tied to the single law does seem to make it look like, politically speaking, it's not going to be as much of just the radicals dogpiling on whatever opportunistic thing that your interest groups happen to be mad at you about. Ideological movements. These movements are movements that exist to push a particular ideological agenda and try and win support for that agenda amongst your pops and interest groups. Examples include both more narrowly focused movements such as abolitionists and suffragettes, who are just going to look to ban slavery or get women's voting, and broader ones such as communists and national liberals. Okay. Next, we have cultural movements, which is kind of a little bit of an intro to some. I wanted to see more cultural elements. The discrimination rework, we really have to see more of what exactly this is going to look like before we can really kind of understand what all this is going to mean for us, but let's read it anyways. These movements that exist to agitate for the rights and privileges of a particular culture, again, we don't really know what that means at this juncture, in a country. Their specific agenda will vary based on whether the culture is primary or minority culture, as well as in the legal status of your country. So this one's going to be really important, what we see in the other Dev Diary, because as a matter of play pattern, multiculturalism as it stands right now, which we're not expecting this to necessarily hold, is just so incredibly meta that not passing it feels horrible. And so you currently abuse agitators in order to pass them. But here we see, I think it's going to be the case that if you have a very large minority movement, you might get really large cultural movements for multiculturalism. Unfortunately, in order to get international migration, you need multiculturalism. So there might be some meta that evolves around trying to maximize your discriminated cultures to spawn a cultural movement to get multiculturalism. I'm thinking this might be where the metagame shifts, depending on how they enact these various mechanics. But let's continue. For example, a cultural minority movement of South Italians in North Italy would oppose the enactment of an ethno-state since it would strip them of their rights, but that does not necessarily mean that they're willing to extend those rights to other less accepted cultures in the country. So it might be hyper meta to just like go for Sindh and Punjab every single run so that you can acquire pops that are just hyper discriminated against in your country, and then once you have those, they can agitate for a cultural movement, because you know that the South Italians aren't going to agitate for the Punjabi people, but the Punjabi people will agitate for everyone because they need the everyone type of discrimination level. There might be, speaking of multiculturalism, there might be migration rework along with the racism rework. Religious movements, similar to cultural movements, but for religions instead. We get a little kind of a screenshot here where we have the pro-slavery movement in the United States is largely, and this is a cursed screenshot, is largely composed of Dixie Pops and has wide-reaching influence in multiple interest groups. You know what the movement's called? The property rights preservation movement. Not like this. Not like this. Okay. Cries an American. Alright, let's keep scrolling. As before, movements here have support and radicalism. Previously, both of these numbers could be a little fuzzy in exactly what they represented. And by a little fuzzy, we mean that the people who would agitate, the radicals that were pro-slavery would turn around and be anti-slavery kind of immediately following. Or at least this is what it felt like. Maybe that was just the fuzziness and we were just confused. As it be sometimes. So we have changed them into straight percentages between 0 and 100%, where 50% support now actually means that about half your country stands behind the movement. And this is going to be coming up. This is a feature I really like. Support is currently calculated from two parts of roughly equal importance: popular support and military support. And this is something that I've always kind of thought, it's not something I've commented on, much like the loud cars, or unlike the loud cars, which I comment on all the time, but who the military supports in terms of the politics and this type of stuff should actually be way more important, because historically speaking, if you have control of the military, you get to, there's some sort of revolution or coup or this type of thing, the side with the military wins. And so now we have two parts equal importance: popular support, of which the military is part of, and military support. So now, what your military IG thinks and keeping your military happy is going to be a lot more important in terms of maintaining social order. The formula is straightforward calculation of the number of individuals in your country that are part of the movement. So in a country of 1 million people, a movement backed by 100k individuals would have a popular support of around 10%. Okay, that all makes sense. Military support is a little more complex and is currently calculated by the fraction of soldier and officer political strength, noting that officers are generally going to be more politically active because they have a higher wage multiplier, although I haven't looked at other modifiers relating to their political activity recently, so there's that. That are part of the movement, representing the fact that officers tend to have a greater sway on the military side taking than the mere enlisted men. So keeping officers happy is going to be important. This also might make paying high wages or low wages in terms of taxes, or the tax section, might make more sense on military for political reasons. I'm not sure. Maybe that's a little too deep. We are also looking ways to tie generals directly into movements and have this impact their military support. Currently, as it stands currently, you use officers, generals, and admirals in order to manipulate who's the head of the IG, which is going to be going away, but this would give them some political power as well. All of this plays an important role if the movement escalates into a civil war, but more on that later. And by later, I think he means way later, because I think there's going to be another dev diary for civil wars. Okay, so How do movements gain the support of pops? Well, very much like interest groups, they now have the attraction weight, which depends completely on the type of nature of the movement. On the type of okay, the abolitionist movement, for instance, might have outsized attraction on literate pops for certain professions, but would also like to attract more pops from religious whose scriptures and traditions take an anti-slavery stance than those ones from those ones which tacitly or overtly approve. I don't know why that sentence was so hard for me to read. Okay, this attraction weight competes with the attraction weight of all of the movements in your country, as individuals can only be part of a single movement at a time. So that means there are not multiple pies. Much like how if you take an apple pie and you slice it into pieces, you can't give someone more than 100% of the pie. You can't give more than 100% political movement support. And if you could, you would solve world hunger. Much like if you could give someone over 100% of a pie. To ensure that this doesn't mean you end up with 20 tiny and fragmented movements, which would be annoying, we are planning to have a system of initial enthusiasm, where new movements start with a boost to their attraction, which fades over time, and eventually supplanted entirely by the next shiny new thing. It's worth noting that we may end up only applying this to ideological movements, i.e. not cultural movements, as it doesn't necessarily make sense that your pops would stop caring about their right to worship freely just because some positivist movement is taking off. Or does it? Okay. Before we move on, it's also worth noting that, just like with interest groups, support for movements isn't something that instantly changes overnight. Which this is going to be good because currently, it definitely feels like what people agitate for in this type of stuff can change overnight or can change on a dime in a way that is not necessarily realistic. Even if a movement is created with a massive attraction weight, it will take some time to pick up supports from other movements. Here we see a pro-Turkish cultural movement in the Ottoman Empire seeks to ensure that Turks remain at the top of Ottoman society and has a fairly strong base of support in the military. We could see that we have a lot of support in the military, 15%, and only a little bit of popular support, which is going to be an interesting one because officers in particular tend to be primary cultured. So this is probably going to make it, if anything, harder to pass multiculturalism. Certainly harder than... that actually sounds like a different type of loud car. I was going to say harder than that loud car has difficulty passing other cars, except that sounds like a moving van or something like that. Anyways, as mentioned above, movements will champion one or several ideologies and have a few different ways in which they will push ideologies. The first and most straightforward is through direct actions. Movements have a level of radicalism, which will go up or down based on how much they perceive the status quo and government's actions to be match their overarching goals. Depending on the level of radicalism, movements will have one of 4 levels of activity. Pardon me. Shout out to Petrol. Here we have passive. Movements with very low radicalism are passive, and notably, also, this means that you're not going to have a bunch of radicals in your country suddenly flip from, one political movement to another, because the movement itself has to gain steam in order to gain this, radicalism level. But let's continue. Movements with very low radicalism are passive and have no direct effects and will only indirectly influence interest groups. More on that below, which is kind of the end of... that guy's passing some dudes. Agitating. That's kind of going to be the end of manipulating stuff with generals or manipulating IG leader with generals and admirals. Agitating. The next step up from passive, agitating movements will influence the enactment chances of laws that they support or oppose. Protesting. Protesting movements have a greater impact on the enactment chances of their supported and opposed laws compared to agitating movements, so we have agitating plus, but also steadily turn their supporters into radicals over time. So, currently, when you have a movement, it just flat out creates radicals over time, but it does seem now that it has to go from this level to this level in order to create radicals. I think if you have a non-revolutionary movement currently, that it still creates radicals over time. And then we have rioting. The highest level of radicalism. Rioting movements will rapidly radicalize their supporters and may take their levels of activity one step further by initiating civil war. Interesting. I wonder if they'll lower workforce ratio for rioting. If you have a political movement that's rioting proportionate to the amount of your country that supports it, like up to 10% reduced. This is probably just too deep in the tank, considering that it's an equilibrium thing anyways, in terms of workforce ratio, but that could be a thing. If you're perpetually in rioting, one group rioting, you probably should have a lower workforce ratio. But okay, what all this means is that movement radicalism is no longer a purely negative thing. So for some time it has not been purely a negative thing, but that's just because the abdication meta, the way it works, currently you need to have enough radicals in order to make a movement revolutionary, in order to abdicate so that you can insta-pass laws. I'm thinking that they are going to get rid of this in this next patch, but currently, sometimes you actually just want more radicals so that you can insta-pass laws that would otherwise be very difficult to pass by using an abdication. So currently, radicalism sometimes you're like, man, I wish I had more radicals. You just don't want enough radicals to start causing turmoil to give you a construction mal. This is kind of the main thing. But currently you can just abdicate your way kind of out of that level of radicalism. Alright. At least not when a movement's goals align with yours. If you work too hard at keeping everyone happy, you might find it difficult to push through any radical changes that aren't backed by your dominant interest groups. And this is kind of the thing, is that you are going to... I'm guessing in order to pass multiculturalism, you're going to need people to be mad in your country, or mad enough to make a group that is maybe not just agitating, but in fact protesting for it. And so you're going to have to make people upset rather than, happy. So it's maybe going to create more of an interesting metagame or minigame relative to how it is now, but we'll see. The other less direct way in which movements affect political politics is the influence they hold over interest groups. And here's kind of the meat and potatoes of what's getting changed that I'm not sure how I feel about. An interest group is considered to be influenced by a movement if they have at least a certain percentage of the interest group's total political strength are members of the movement, and if the interest group can be influenced by multiple political movements. The most significant effect is how this impacts leader IG ideologies. Or IG leader ideologies. And this is kind of the main thing. As it stands right now, there's a lot of things you can do to change or manipulate the leader IG, leader ideology. Currently, the leader ideology just 100% overwrites what the base support ideology of the interest group are. And so it is hugely impactful, probably way too impactful, and this is kind of the side at which I think things should be changed. But currently, you can promote an agitator to government, and you can also exile a current leader of an interest group. As it stands currently, when you exile an interest group leader, the person who will take over will be your most popular general or admiral in that interest group. I've read that it's a weighted role, heavily weighted towards the most popular, but I've never seen anyone but the most popular take it, with the one exception of if you have a historic character that's kind of waiting in the wings and hasn't spawned yet, that historic character can take over the IG instead. Now, what this means is that what this is going to affect is you will no longer be able to do that. Currently, this is basically the only way to consistently pass multiculturalism. And we've kind of beaten this dead horse, but this is what this is about, and this is what we've been referring to, both in this dev diary and the previous one. Previously, when an interest group got a new leader, that leader would pick an ideology from a weighted list of all the ideologies in the game, except you would... This is not even probably the best way of explaining. Usually it would be pulled from one of your generals or admirals, and you would not have a rolled leader. But yes, when you would roll a leader, when there was no general or admiral that was eligible, because none were popular, or you didn't have one of a particular interest group, then you would roll one from one of the weighted list of all the ideologies in the game, with heavier weights if you have laws that they don't support, this type of stuff, minus ones that were scriptable or to be unavailable or have a weight of 0 for that leader, but this has now been reduced to a much shorter list. Leader ideologies can now only be picked from a set of basic ideologies inherent to the interest group itself, or from one of the movements that is influencing the interest group. Now, it's not saying that you cannot roll the generals or admirals in, but I feel like this is implied, which means that you are going to need to create somehow political movements to support what it is that you want to pass, and then get a lot of people from that particular IG supporting that political movement, and then once they support that political movement, they will in turn influence the chance that someone comes into the IG leadership. But again, this is just it still feels like a role, and you're RNG dependent on getting the particular interest group in charge of the government, in terms of the leader ideology. And if you have a 40% clout, if you have a 40% clout IG, whether or not you roll the right ideology in is going to 100% influence your ability to act with any sort of agency. Whether you have an 80% chance of rolling the ideology you want or a 20% chance, it's still like an RNG roll that's not going to have... Yeah. I don't know. I do think that this is way better from a simulation perspective, though, the changes that they're making. So, but just from a gameplay perspective, this leaves me with some mixed feelings. With movement ideologies tending to have stronger weights than the basic ones. This also means that the ideological selection can now actually be predicted and displayed so that you can have an educated guess about the way political winds are blowing towards your IGs. So I think, is it going to include it here? Okay, so we see leader ideology chances, and this is much more transparent, and the transparency definitely helps. If you don't know what causes the weights of particular IGs to be rolled, this is going to be really, really nice for you, and so is going to help you to be able to make decisions. But you can see, here's our chances of rolling stuff. Jacksonian Democrat from the property... Jesus Christ. The Property Rights Preservation Movement. We have the Abolitionists from the Abolitionists United Assembly. But it's still traditionalist, moderate, etc. But it's still the case that, look, we either roll our Jacksonian Democrat or we roll our Abolitionist, and 100% of the evangelical clout in terms of what you can use to pass laws just goes over to that ideology. And so it's still it's not like it's splitting the power of the evangelicals one way and the other way, which is what a proper simulation would do, right? Where 45% of the evangelicals are Jacksonian Democrats and 30% are abolitionists, and it splits the clout in terms of how you can vote and also for the approval of the evangelicals. It's just like a light switch. You roll the slavers, and suddenly they're mad you're passing slavery, and you roll the abolitionists, and suddenly they absolutely love you. And it's no, it would just be a mixed bag either way. But okay, this effectively means that the influencing movements serve as factions inside the interest group competing to install a leader and take control of the IG, and by take control, it's total control, for as long as the leader remains in power. We are also considering allowing movements to have permanent effects of the ideologies of the interest groups. This would help somewhat to lessen the effect of leader IGs, but this is tricky to pull off in a way that doesn't end up with the IG changing its core identity every 10 years or so I don't want to promise that it'll be a part of the 1.5 update just yet. As far as prose goes, we very, very rarely see the first person. I just wanted to note that, just in terms of writing, this is something that I noticed. I think that this is the... yeah, we don't see it too often, but okay. This is it's it's just going to be super light switchy. You're either going to be pro-slavery or you're going to be an abolitionist, and it's just flipping a coin a little bit. 30% versus 45% is a little like flipping a coin. And what if that IG leader lives for 30 years? You're just stuck with them in charge. It's not like there's a changing of the winds. It's not like there's a mechanic that re-rolls ideology leader consistently. You're just stuck with them for an extended period of time, which also is maybe not the best simulation. But the way it stands is it's just it's super RNG. You either roll it or you don't, and you can either pass the laws or you can't. The final changes I want to go into this dev diary is agitators, and this was a bit of an interesting one, which of course had to go through some changes to fit in this new system. For the most part, agitators work exactly as before. They appear and start movements, can be exiled, and so on. A relatively minor change is that instead of directly adding support to a movement, they now increase the pop attraction by an amount partially scaling to their popularity. So having Frederick Engels, penning columns singing the praise of your socialist movement will attract more socialists over time. As long as he's popular. The most significant change is that we have flipped the script on what agitators' interest group membership means from their political leanings. Previously, and this is pretty substantive, previously an agitator, much like an IG leader, would look to their ideology first and interest group ideology second when determining what laws they support. Meaning, if you have a communist that is, an industrialist versus a communist that's a trade unionist, everything that the communist ideology does not specifically speak on, it would look instead to their interest group to see what they think about that thing. So the ideology, the character ideology overwrites everything, but the interest group ideology provides the underlying structure. Meaning that you would sometimes get pretty strange bedfellows and a bunch of rural folk agitators of varying ideologies trying to implement national militia all over the place for rather unclear reasons, because they're rural folk. Instead of anchoring agitators fully to their ideologies of their IGs, we've decided that their own ideology traits and any other such circumstances should be what determines part of which movement they want to support. Should be what determines what movement they want to support. So, instead of saying, we could see a rural folk, not reactionary, the rural folk who wants to, oh my god, I'm going completely blank on the name, but the one that want to pass, like, schools, and the other stuff, they want to get, like, labor laws in schools, like that ideology, completely drawing a blank. They won't just randomly also want to support militia as well. Instead, they'll just stick to their ideology, is the way I read this, which makes agitators much more precise an instrument if you're inviting them, and also just like kind of way more random. I do think that this is an improvement rather than them just agitating for a bunch of random stuff that their IG supports, which the leader themselves might not be that on board with. Maybe we see a little bit of nuance where agitators might have two ideologies, which would be interesting, two character ideologies. Like a primary one and a secondary one, and then if they became a politician, they would revert just to their primary. That could be something that's interesting to make them agitate for more things, but they won't be just now base agitating, I think, if I'm reading this correctly, for all the stuff that the IG supports. In other words, agitators are now much more fixated on specific ideas, and if there's insufficient support for those ideas in your country to get a movement they would actually care about support going, they might not even be available to invite. That is interesting that you can't necessarily invite someone, so they cannot be the impetus for a movement that does not yet exist. On the other hand, we're looking into loosening the rules somewhat around which agitators you can invite based on discrimination status. Huge for anyone who's not European, but we haven't worked out the details, so more on that on another time. Currently, as it stands, playing as a European power is a huge advantage from the perspective of agitator invites, because most of the agitators in game are European. Most of the good agitators are European, and if you're not European, you can't get acceptance very easily so that you can invite them. You require multiculturalism, again, to be able to invite the agitators, and so if they make a bunch of changes that makes multiculturalism not as good, not being able to pass it won't be as bad. But okay. And again, this is just a pure metagame thing. In terms of a simulation, like, it's not necessarily the case that the player should have agency in some spots, which are frustrating to not have agency in, but the thing that, like, I keep coming back to is not, like, it's perhaps less the lack, well, to some extent it's the lack of agency, but, like, just stuff's not fun when it's really RNG dependent. And it feels like, if multiculturalism is just hard blocked and it's still important, then that's not as bad as multiculturalism just being super RNG dependent, right? Something being really RNG dependent is fundamentally what causes frustration, which is why, since leader ideology is so important, why I don't like this. Like, I don't like that we're like, this is an improvement in the sense that, okay, now it's transparent. It's sounding like, to be fair, they haven't explicitly said that you won't be able to do the generals and admirals thing. But if you can't do the generals and admirals thing, well, also this might just be implying to the generals and admirals you recruit, and the generals and admirals thing is still in which case it will be impossible for you to roll some outside ideology. But impossibility is actually preferable to, in my opinion, is preferable to, like, being RNG dependent. Yeah. Okay. It would, of course, not be possible to make all these changes without making major changes to civil wars, particular secessions, how they tie into cultural, religious movements. The big thing I'm excited for is they said it was equally important, military support and popular support. I'm excited to see the support of the military take a bigger kind of seat at the table when it comes to revolutions. I think they should be of central importance, and it doesn't seem like that now. But we'll cover that all separately a bit later in Dev Diary with more detailed information on how the radicalism works. You remember how he said we'd cover that later, like at the start of the Dev Diary? He meant in a later Dev Diary. Big sad. If you were here from the start, when we read that long ago in the time far away, and you were hoping for resolution, you're not getting it here. For now, I'll wish you a happy Thursday. Weird that he spelled it like a French word, but he will wish us a happy Thursday and encourage you to check again next week. So we're not going to have the off week where Lino will tell you all about discrimination, the ways it's going to be changing in 1.8. We, of course, will be receiving a happy Thursday from Lino. Is it Lino or Lino? I think it's Lino. I forget the pronunciation. But see you then. We will. And for that, with all that, I think we're going to conclude and wish you guys a happy Thursday. Big nice. Have a happy Thursday.